Hi, welcome to Aspire Data Streams, where two solutions architects are going to solve world peace and help you modernize your data center so you can actually realize the cloud benefits. How's everyone doing? I'm Christian Chavez. I'm Aspire Technology Partners Data Center Cloud Solutions Architect. I'm one of your moderators, if you want to call it, or I'm Jack Faber's side half here of what we're going to do here. But go ahead, Jack. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Christian. I'm Jack Faber. I'm also a data center solution architect with a focus on cloud as well at Aspire Technology Partners, and we're going to talk about what you can do with that cloud.
Yeah, what we can do with that cloud. That's the funny part. Cloud is a little bit nebulous in terms, but anyway. So yeah, so what we're looking to accomplish today is just we're going to talk about how in today's data centers, most people are looking to move out the cloud. A lot of people have questions on what that means. How do we do it? Where should I be? What should I move? There's a lot of questions that come out of that. But I think to start things off, I'd really like to level set the term cloud, right? I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's a bit nebulous in terms of what it really means. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we are going to try to give our opinions, I guess, right? We have thoughts into what cloud is and what it means to you and your business and how you can leverage it. But let me give you real quick. I want to put out the term here, Jack. If you give me a minute here, because we got to go to Gartner, right? We got to go to Gartner. And I just kind of want to read off what Gartner says about cloud computing, right? So Gartner has it, and it's quoted: cloud computing is a style of computing in which scalable and elastic IT-enabled capabilities are delivered as a service using internal technologies. So when we're thinking about cloud, Jack, right? I mean, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, Jack, when I say cloud? Give me one word.
Invisible.
Invisible. There you go. That's one of them. I'm thinking AWS,
Right.
right? I'm thinking the big three, right? We're going to talk about the big three, but we're also going to move a little bit past the big three because in today's terms, right, we think of the big three, but there's also and what they're called hyperscalers, right? If for those of you who want to know that they're called hyperscalers, but there's also other cloud solutions that are out there that are still considered cloud, right? And you're still consuming as a service. Um, so those are kind of the things that I want to get into. So Jack, give me the big three. Let's hear it.
AWS, Google, and Azure, right? Microsoft.
There you go.
Everybody
Right.
knows them, but everybody uses other clouds all day long, every day. Apple, Facebook, we got all their other hyperscalers out there that leverage one of those three or do their own. So it's people that say they don't do cloud don't even realize they're doing cloud, right?
Exactly. Right. I think even us, like you had mentioned, right? Apple. How many of us have phones and our data is actually living in the cloud, right? So we're even though we're not doing any IT, I don't have any servers. My phone is actually connected to the cloud. So yeah, so they're leveraging those hyperscalers and maybe their own clouds to do their business on there, right? But ultimately on the back end, right, we're here to talk about the data center, but the reason why I wanted to start off with cloud is because the outcome of modernizing your data center is to better realize the cloud benefits, right? So cloud does have a lot of benefits, but it also has it's a double-edged sword, right? um, where you can have the benefits, but at the same time you can get burned. And I think I know a lot of people in the industry that were burned and kind of have a sour taste in their mouth in terms of what cloud is, and they kind of move things back and forth. Have you seen any of that, Jack? And with your clients that you've dealt with that have maybe consumed cloud or coming back?
Yeah, I have. Many of the customers are really trying to provide a cloud-like environment for their companies, right? Their organizations, for their internal users and customers to consume. But traditionally, the way they used to do that with older archaic architectures and other practices or operations practices were um, it was difficult for them to provide those kind of services just because of the speed in which you can procure hardware, the developers, the time it takes developers to roll out applications, and just the physical interaction with those groups of people and customers that you have to provide services to. It's all very manual and arduous and very tedious to deploy and provide services. The cloud-like solution is making those kinds of consumable resources available to those people with, like I said before, the invisibility of that cloud, right?
Right. It's abstracted from them. They're just consuming it as either a service and there's a monthly payment. We're all used to
That's
subscriptions nowadays, right?
right.
Everything's a subscription. But so you had mentioned a good thing, right? There's a lot of people who are looking for that agility to expand out the cloud. To me, I kind of look at the cloud adoption, right? So I have clients that are looking to adopt cloud, some that have already, have done it and are either coming back. Maybe, like I'd mentioned before, there's a bad taste. So I see it as there's two different drivers of getting people to cloud, right? I look at it one from a data center modernization aspect of it, and that even that term in itself could mean a lot of things. There are people that actually want to modernize so they can actually do like hybrid cloud, or they want to do multi-cloud. But there's also data center modernization where they just want to get out of the data center space, right? They don't want to pay um, to build data centers with cooling, power, servers, things like that. That you just constantly, there's a capex to that. So that's one key aspect of a cloud adoption. The other thing would be application modernization, and again, that's another term that you could look at it in multiple ways. Where you either have an application that you're looking to modernize, whether that's going from a monolithic to a more of a consumer based, meaning like if you go in AWS, you can use some of their services. So now you have these microservices that you're leveraging. So now you have all these you have this modularity to your application. So I see those two drivers being the adoption of cloud, and ultimately, you and I are talking about data center modernization, right? Application modernizations is just a whole different conversation, which we'll probably have another one of these to maybe tackle that piece. But in this case, data center modernization. I know you've helped plenty of clients do some of that, Jack, right? And so, do you have an example of maybe what you've gone through in terms of data center modernization for a client who wanted to stretch out the cloud?
Yeah, a lot of the work I do is data center focused and across all verticals with manufacturing and healthcare and retail and banking and financial. A lot of the easy stuff or the low hanging fruit is almost always storage or backup and recovery solutions. It's easy enough to put my files or my um, code or whatever it is up into the cloud because I don't have to buy a storage array. I don't have to configure and maintain and carve up storage for different departments or different developers to use. It's easy to turn on with a credit card or with an account at one of these providers and spin up an infrastructure to do some analytics or some programming or some protection of data. So that's the easy part. The thing that is more difficult, obviously, is managing those things. I'll just put my application of my entire business in the cloud. Sounds easy, but there's hidden costs, there's hidden complexity, there's all kinds of gotchas around that as far as performance and as far as sovereignty of your data and all kinds of things that could come into play. So the modernization of those applications could happen without using one of those cloud providers we mentioned in a conceptual way. You want to provide services to your company or organization using those concepts, but also they make it economically attractive to use those resources, become more agile, spend money on stuff that I can turn off, and retire if I don't like the project that I was working on, as opposed to procuring a whole data center full of gear and shutting down the business and having a whole pile of metal to get rid of. So there's all kinds of stuff like that.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and so I mean, going back to what you said about a lot of complexity that goes into doing something like that. Are you saying that there's not an easy button?
Hmm.
I've heard there is.
Well,
I've heard
you
there is.
mentioned coming back. There's some repatriation. So in the early days, it was easy. I'm just going to put all my storage in the cloud, and then those bills started coming in. And I'm not saying this is true in every case, but there's been some repatriation of data and some applications because it wasn't all that it was promised to be, whether it was performance or whether it was cost or whether it was, maybe I don't know. My programmers don't know how to use the cloud because they're used to doing a mainframe and some archaic coding languages that only work in my building. Um, so,
Yeah.
so yeah.
I feel like the biggest benefit from cloud, right? And obviously, there's a ton of things that we can mention, and you and I could probably sit here for quite some time and just go back and forth. But ultimately, it comes down to cost optimization, right? We hear that the cloud is cheaper. We can do cost optimization there. We can do a lot of these things that can work around the cost of things. And ultimately, we want to get our data centers down to something more manageable in terms of costs. Where you had mentioned, you had said where I have to buy hardware for a specific application or project. And if that project fails or just goes away, I end up with gear that I now have inside of my data center that I still have to power and cool or at least store somewhere, right? So cost optimization to me is probably one of the biggest key pieces, right? But at the end of the day, to get to that cost optimization, you can't do lift and shift, because lift and shift, I think, is where a lot of people got burned when they were trying to get to the cloud, right? They heard this new thing. You're agile, you're flexible, we can do all those things. And all they took was the ball of wax. They lifted it up and moved it over. And at the end of the day, they weren't cost optimized. That's why we're talking about this today, right? In order to get those benefits and not just cost optimization, but the scalability, the flexibility, we say elasticity, and all these things ultimately come down to you modernizing your existing data center, because at the end of the day, I think there's still some consumption that's on-prem that stays. There's a hybrid aspect to projects that are happening, or there's multi-cloud, right? So I just wanted to dive into some of the data center pieces so we can realize these benefits. What do we have to do inside of data center that gets us to a point where now, once we've modernized internally, we can now look and realize, how do we move these things out the cloud, and what are my costs savings there, right? Because maybe I'm just going to move a project out, an application. Maybe it's just some compute, or like you had mentioned, storage. One of the biggest things that I see are like offsite backups or disaster recovery, something of that thing. So, but what happens is now we're in a data center that's pretty much siloed, right? At least the traditional data center that I used to seeing, right? You have your storage, you have your compute, you have networking, and all these other key components that are kind of like, they're traditional. They're, I log in, I do my thing, and they kind of don't talk to each other. Where that's not the cloud, right? Um, Specifically, what are you seeing today in those three areas, like compute, storage, networking, that might put us in a position that actually allows us to become hybrid or multi-cloud?
Yeah, so the easy answer there is virtualization, right? Everything is software driven, software defined, whether it's networking, wide area networking, data center networking, the virtualization of the servers themselves that everybody's doing via Hyper-V or VMware generally. There's some other players out there, but almost the whole world says VMware, right? That's the way that we abstract those requirements for all those physical boxes and cooling and heating and all that stuff, and make better our consumption of those resources. So without being in any cloud that's owned by a public provider, we can shrink those costs just by doing smart things as far as virtualization and consolidation in code. Um, to get more efficient at that, if you start using the cloud and you start using someone else's infrastructure, some other reduction of costs as far as physical cooling, heating, space, um, all those things, you start to realize more and more benefits if your business model supports those things. So to go back a step or two, the business model and the business itself is the thing that's going to drive these opportunities for cost savings, right? So if we've got a business application that we know can make a lot of money if we stand it up quick, or we could profit a lot more if we take our existing application that's doing just fine and reduce costs behind it, or make it more efficient, or be able to provide it more effectively, then we're going to win as an organization. So there's all different ways to look at cloud, and almost always it's a simplification or a modernization, to use the word, but it's making those processes better so I can do the same thing I'm doing and make money in a better way because I'm not spending as much, or provide new services in a faster, better way and start making more money, not doing it the old way. And there's layers in between that you can't name all the different permutations of that, right? So
Yeah, no, it's so many of these components now. So software defined, right? You talked about virtualization in itself, software defined data centers. We have SDDC now. We have software defined storage. We have software defined networks. So all these things are able to scale, through a layer of abstraction from the silos that we're so ingrained with, right? So we put this virtualization layer on top of it, and we're able to just move things around as we see fit or as applications need. Very little need of a lot of interaction. We can even automate some of these things that we're doing nowadays. So if we talk specifically around storage, there are storage vendors out there that are doing such a thing where you're not only consuming your traditional storage on top of it, but there are other hooks into storage that are give you the ability to push out the cloud, right? So now you have this connected storage component in your data center that scales out to cloud, any one of the vendors that you want to look at, right? And as I'd mentioned earlier, there are other players in the space that are doing cloud services, infrastructure as a service, that you can actually stretch out to those even inside of storage, right? So the storage companies now are getting into the software defined aspect, where we can now have some data here, some data in a cloud service somewhere else, and even other on-prem solutions if you have other locations that you're dealing with, right? And it's all centrally managed, because at the end of the day, right, it comes down to how, if I'm got storage here, compute here, and all these things floating all over the place, how do I all bring that all together without having to log into every single one of these things? Because that typically becomes a problem, right?
Mhm.
I always say that whenever we provide a solution for a client, we always introduce pain,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't matter. It could be an educational pain because there's a learning curve. It could be pain because we've just added another tool, to your infrastructure. It could be pain because there's just another process that your team has to deal with. And sometimes you actually have to build another team to be able to support the solution that's being introduced, right? So there's a lot of these things that we were siloed. We're looking to now stretch out to some type of virtualization across compute, storage, network, and then once these things are all connected and you've kind of built you're modernizing, right? You've taken on the virtualization aspect. You got the storage that can scale out as needed to other clouds. You have the software defined networks, right? SD-WAN is huge to be able to connect to other locations, including cloud, right? But then we get into the point of, okay, now that we have all these things out there, right? We're modernizing, right? We'll just keep saying that we're modernizing. We're getting there.
Mhm.
We're starting to churn here. There's a security aspect to it, right? So now we have to start not only think about just what we've put out in cloud, but now we have to manage security across multiple clouds, right? Including on-prem. And now our users are now not just connecting to headquarters, they're connecting to here, they're connecting to there, you know, things like that. What are you seeing? So I'm a data center guy. I know you are. I'm not sure if you've seen a ton of data center, but I hear a lot of our guys talk about security, and that's usually on my mind. What do you think of when you're thinking of security? Like, have you seen anything, done anything with
Yeah,
it?
security is huge, and it's there's this operational portion of backup and recovery, right? People are deleting files. You get some disgruntled employees that decide to take hedge clippers to the network closet when they're way out, and they want to destroy data, or maybe not even nefarious. There's just some bug or some problem that causes data loss. That's a problem. That can be handled with backup and recovery in a traditional way, or these other more modern, more effective cloud ways. The security is getting more and more nefarious when we start talking about ransomware and we start talking about malicious players
Yeah,
that are
huge.
stealing data and stealing money. So when you talk about restoring a large infrastructure of an organization, because not only are the data files that I run my business with corrupted and encrypted, but also those ransomware guys are now learning how, and their first target really is those backups as well. So they're going to make it so not only that you lose your data unless you give them the give them the ransom and you get the encryption keys back, but they make it so that your backup and recoveries that you would fall back to are also effective. So you got to pay. Oversimplification, of course, um, but with those cloud type of separations, those air gaps, those other locations where you can not only just store data again in a cloud that's pretty cost effective, you can also spin up and run workloads from that cloud and recover while you're rebuilding an infrastructure, while you're physically recovering in your other location and quote unquote fail back. All the vendors in that space, all the manufacturers are coming up with better and new solutions to stay ahead of the bad guys, and they're doing pretty well. And there's lots of opportunities for diversifying your workloads and protecting your data centers in a DR way or in a multi-site active kind of way to provide applications and services. So cloud's always a part of that. And, we can talk about security in all different ways, but just because your data is up in the cloud doesn't mean it's not secure. There's tons of vendors that have ported their applications or provide their own services within those major cloud providers. So you can get a certain vendor's firewall appliance or certain vendor's analytics tool for data protection. You can spin those things up in the cloud and use them like they were in your physical infrastructure, and do both. You can have them physically in your environment and have the cloud version of those said things up in the cloud doing a similar job. So it's that expandability. It's that easy way to keep protecting what you're protecting, not only here but also out there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I know in talking with our security engineers, again, it's I like to hear about that. It's not my world. I'm data center. You hit it right on the head with when I deal with security. It's typically about your backups,
Mm-hmm.
right? And ransomware is huge nowadays, right? We're hearing that left and right. We're talking now about immutability. We're talking about air gapping. So there's a lot of these things that are starting to bubble back up. I mean, air gapping was something that we did, back in the day. That's when somebody put something on a tape drive and walked it off to their house, and
Mm-hmm.
and that was your air gap, right? You couldn't get to it at that point, and all these things are coming up when it comes to things like that. And I know there are at the storage level, right? There are storage vendors who are actually providing you some of this immutability as well as some air gapping and as part of their process, and including the backup software companies now, right? Everyone's talking immutability, which is not something new, but I think something that maybe have been overlooked. It just seems that I'm having more and more of those conversations in terms of backup, because at the end of the day, if you do get hit with ransomware, I'm going to let the security guys handle. We got some great security guys, and they handle that part of the infrastructure very well. They know how to protect the keys to the kingdom. They know how to get things in place, on prem or out in the cloud. But at the same time, it's one of those things that it's not a 100% guaranteed solution. In other words, there's ways to get in. There's exploits. I mean, we've got a new one floating around
Mm-hmm.
now, right?
Sure.
In the log system, right? And that's big in the news today. We're talking, everyone is doing. I mean, I know some guys in some large organizations who are spending the day just remediating, this big exploit that is wild right now. So when you're talking ransomware, for me, backups are key. I help clients get a great backup strategies in place. A lot of that is using external clouds, right? There are some services out there to keep backups off site, and then executing on some of that
Sure.
immutability. But air gapping is, I think, is one of the next
Yeah.
things that we're talking
in
about.
in the days
Um,
of yore, that used to be a very physical, manual, arduous process, right? You had to actually get a server that was like your old one, get a storage array that had similar file formats or software that you could use to restore your backups to. You would have to rebuild those physical servers and restore. Now it's so abstracted that you could even put an array or a product, a storage target or location that's just like and uses the format of the cloud. So I can write my backups locally in a format that the cloud understands and vice versa. So when I was going to restore it, it would be like restoring it from my data center room, but I'm pulling that file from a cloud location if I had to restore that way. Before it used to be like a translation. You had to figure out how can I get this
right.
file that's of a crazy different format down to my new hardware that I just built and figure out how to turn it on and let my people do it. Hours and days pass by before those kinds of things happen. Now you can spin up workloads pretty readily, pretty easily in multiple locations. So it makes
Oh,
all that stuff
definitely,
way easier.
definitely. Yeah, yeah, and so in talking about these different components, and there's a lot more right inside the data center. But if we're hitting on the key ones, right, we'd mentioned the compute aspect, the storage aspect. There's networking and there's security. There's backups that we need to consider, right? So all these things, in terms of modernization, have the ability to live on prem, out in cloud. We have some security built on top of it. We're not siloed anymore. We're able to stretch wherever we want. Now, the key, I mean, to me, one of the benefits of putting or modernizing your data center, right, is because we're software defined, we can now, all these vendors, everyone is pushing out APIs. There's a lot of things that we can do with automation. So not only are we able to have an infrastructure that can scale out, but we have the ability to talk to it in a way that we can now scale out automatically,
Mhm.
right? So if we need additional resources, One of the biggest benefits that I saw cloud was the fact that we had self service, right? I could just go to a cloud provider, provide a credit card. I think you mentioned this right in the very
Mhm.
beginning, right? I can go with a credit card and just start spinning things up, right? And then obviously I can automate these things. So the self service aspect, if you do something internally, organizations can now push self service out to their developers or their engineers if they need resources, and all this is being driven on the background, with automation and leveraging APIs that are available to us. So the flexibility aspect of modern data center gets us to the point where we're now able to now not only have running applications or running processes on prem, but if we wanted to, right, we don't need to buy infrastructure, because if we have a development team who has a project and they're just in proof of concept phase, or maybe they're starting to develop, we're able to now leverage scale out to cloud, consume some cloud resources, maybe some cloud services that are being provided for building microservices on the back end. So we're now able to stretch out to cloud programmatically through self service to a development team. How cool is
Yeah,
that, right? Um,
sure. Yeah,
you got anything
yeah.
on?
Most of
Yeah, what?
there
Yeah.
was a problem early on with the cloud that there was that credit card aspect of it. You could not be able to know what was going on in your organization. There was what was called rogue IT, right? You had a bunch of developers that had thousands of dollars a month in spends, doing their work that should have been being provided by, you know, should have been done on equipment that was provided by you or maintained or managed, right? So now
Mhm.
there's better integrations with all kinds of different platforms for management and all kinds of automated ways that you can interact with those developers and those other groups within your organization to, in a software defined way, programmatically let them have the controls of that cloud, but still maintain the management and have your eyes on the spend and have it not run out of control. So those APIs are
Yeah.
everywhere. If you're not doing your work using APIs, integrating with equipment locally or stuff in the cloud, you got to learn how to do to work with APIs for everything. So, and most vendors are
Oh
getting
yeah.
way better about providing access and having open standards around APIs where you can start integrating different components of applications and infrastructure and everything else into a more central management uh, window pane, right? Hate to use that analogy, but
Yeah.
um, you know, there's software
It, it,
defined ways to
it,
keep track of everything now. It's not just the Wild West out there in the cloud. So,
and so that's really key, because well, side note here, I think I was one of those rogue guys, right? I used to work for a managed hosting provider, and they've given you access, so they gave us access to AWS, and so yeah, we had a certain subset amount of credits that we could use, but when you go hog wild, you have these things running in the back end, right? We're trying to do some development work, and we got things running in the back end, and then hey, it works, right? So we have access to this. We don't have to build anything internally. We don't have to go through these. There was no request process, so that was again, you talked about Rogue, and so we had these VMs running out in AWS that were connecting back to some of the systems that we had internally, and there was no, even though we documented it in terms of what was connected, there was no visibility to it from internal, right? Because it was stretching out. So we weren't, again, the rogue aspect of it, but we loved the fact that there was self-service, that we were able to just spin up what we needed, and the amount that we needed. Sometimes maybe it was a little more,
yeah.
whatever, but still, that's sort of what happens. And this goes back to what I had said earlier on, right? Was the fact that to me, I honestly believe that the true benefit is cost optimization, but you can't have cost optimization if you don't leverage APIs, if you don't leverage the systems that are put in place for you to monitor, a lot of these things. You can monitor practically anything now in the cloud as well as inside of your data center. So if you're not monitoring and you're not looking for ways to cost optimize, then the benefits of cloud, at least from a cost perspective, aren't going to be there for you. You may end up paying more. And I think a lot of that's the driver for people to say, "Hey, I've tried this, but it costs too much. It's cheaper for me to buy a simple server." But then again, what you're doing is you're pinching yourself back into a siloed world, because you're going back and you're running back to what you're used to, right? I was used to it ran. If I needed a project, I bought a server,
Mhm.
right? And so again, I had mentioned earlier was data center modernization, or at least getting out of the data center business, is one of the things that's driving people to cloud, right? So looking at that, automation, API, flexibility for deployment, so I can scale out my resources as needed, based on projects or applications. We didn't even get into the application side of things, right? In terms of building that and automating some of that, but at least just from the infrastructure level, now have the ability to even do like configuration management, right? We could do this at the network layer. We could do this at the storage level. We see the data management aspect of the world, right, starting to collapse into one. Problem is that everyone's building a data management system that collapses into one, and we still end up with multiple, data management platforms that are helping drive some of this visibility, the automation, a lot of these APIs that we're talking about. This is Christian Chavez, and we're going to end part one here. We're going to continue our discussion in part two, and we hope you'll join us. You can find these videos at aspiretransforms.com under resources, or just search for data streams on our website.